Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Providing a Modern Learning Experience, sponsored by Cornerstone On Demand on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest is John Ogren, the Chief Learning Officer of the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA in the Department of Commerce. Now, John, before break, we're getting to know you a little bit, understanding your approach to training, workforce development. Let's talk one step down and talk about the idea of developing leaders. And I know that a leader is not necessarily a position, but it's a person, but you still have to ensure that each person, no matter where they are in the organization, has those characteristics and capabilities that we're talking about. So talk about the National Weather Service's approach.
Sure, absolutely. And I don't know that it's that different from other places, but it's the part I know. Leadership certainly is a position. I hold a leadership position within the National Weather Service. But as I mentioned earlier, we've got a workforce that will have a lot of retirements, and we need to develop the leaders of the future. And so a lot of our approach for leadership development is that, leadership is a behavior. It's not necessarily a position. So, at any given time, you may be the star of the show. And so as an example, if you're in a major tornado outbreak in the Midwest, for example, and you're having some technical issues, in fact, I'll use a real example back of a tornado outbreak in Indianapolis when I was working there. And the fact of the matter is that we had a sick radar. We had parts that went bad. And for 12 hours, our electronics technicians were there working on that radar, trying to get us as much data as we possibly could. We were still using surrounding radars as backup radars. But the fact of the matter is we couldn't do our job without those electronic technicians that day. And they helped us make the mission, and they were the ones that really saved the day. So when I talk about leadership as a behavior, that was it. Both of those guys came in. It was a weekend. It was a holiday weekend, Memorial Day. You have the Indianapolis 500 going. One of the guys was actually at the race, left the race to come to work to help get the radar up so we could actually do our job during a very significant tornado outbreak. So leadership comes from all levels, and those are the types of things that we start to lay down that foundation from the very first year that you join the Weather Service. So it took us a long time. About 3 years ago, we started a new hire orientation program, and we bring in every new hire to the Weather Service in here to Kansas City and really start laying down that foundation, trying to create the culture that we want, is that leadership comes from everywhere, and everyone plays a role in meeting the mission. And so it doesn't matter if you're an administrative assistant. We need to make sure we have the supplies we need to make sure that we can do our jobs. The electronics folks are making sure that the equipment's running optimally. The forecasters have got the highest skill set so they can meet the mission as well. And so you very quickly realize that we're extremely reliant on one another, and that at any given moment, you may be the one coming up with the idea or doing the act to save the day.
And especially when you talk about the National Weather Service, where you have people who love what they do. We talked about this earlier, people who've always wanted to be meteorologists or work in the weather sector, and now they're there, and they don't always want to be a manager. They don't always want to be somebody who is in charge of other people, but they still need those leadership qualities. And I think you brought this up. I think that's a great point, because a lot of agencies end up promoting the people who are technically sound, but not necessarily fit for leadership. And just because you're a leader doesn't mean you have to be in a leadership position.
Absolutely. One of the simple definitions of leadership is influence. And so how are you going to influence the process? And you can do that from anywhere. And you don't necessarily need to be a manager to do that. And you're absolutely right. Not everybody wants to be a manager. And because they're entirely different skill sets. And that's another area we're also working on, is how do we do better about hiring effective managers and supervisors? And you were alluding to it. Two things happen. You take your best person, your best technical person, and you say, wow, they are really spectacular. We should make them the boss. And then two things sometimes happen. Is one, you lose your best technician or forecaster in our case, and you may gain your worst supervisor, because they're entirely different skill sets. So something that we're working on is to hire the right people as managers and supervisors. And you don't have to be a manager and supervisor to be successful in a career. If you're a great forecaster and that's what you want to do, that's good. We like that.
Go ahead.
I've progressed through my career, and hopefully I was good at both. but you got to find the right people and put them in the right chair at the right time.
I want to go down that path of how you're ensuring you're hiring effective managers and supervisors. Before I do that, I think I want to get back to one other thing you mentioned, which was around bringing people to Kansas City, all new hires. Too often that new hire orientation is done online now, or it's done kind of piecemeal where, okay, I'm in New York, we'll do it in New York, or I'm in Boston, I'll do it in Boston. But by bringing everyone to Kansas City and bringing them, whether it's for 1 day or 5 days, it really doesn't matter. It's a culture you're creating because everyone hears the same presentation. Is that really key as part of that workforce development, that training piece?
Yeah, absolutely. And the feedback has been tremendous from those that have come here. And it's important to know it's not all early career. Okay, so certainly we have a lot of early career people coming right out of college, but we're also bringing in people that are vets coming out of DOD. We also have people, maybe they were a 20-year employee at NASA who transferred to the Weather Service. They're entirely different cultures. And so we're bringing them in regardless of age, regardless of how far along in their career they are, to really understand who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And the support from senior leadership has really been tremendous. We have either the director, the deputy director, or the chief operations officer come to every single class and spend over a half a day with them. I think back early on in my career, I don't think I set my eyes on a director for probably 15 years, and so it's a really good opportunity to set those expectations of who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And that idea came from the field offices. It came from the bottom up. It was a demand signal that say, hey, I get good training in my local office, but I get it from my manager, I get it from my coworkers, and it's small. It's good, but it's small because it may be the culture of your local office. How do we really set the culture for the entire National Weather Service? And this is one of the tools we use. It's also blended. And so we certainly utilize online modules, and so those are prerequisites that they would take before coming here. So we want to lay down that foundation of core knowledge, and that way when they are here in residence, because that's expensive, that we really want to maximize that. So a lot of the work that they're doing is activity-based, and so they're learning the organizational structure, they're learning how we work, they're learning what each other do, and appreciate that, yeah, the electronics technicians are important to the meteorologists because we need our equipment to run. And so it's really been successful. About 3 years old, so we're doing some surveys and we're trying to find out if, what the real return on investment is, but anecdotally from our surveys, it's really been positive.
One of the things that if I'm another agency listening to this, the answer is always, well, the National Weather Service, they're small. Right? You guys only have 4,000 employees. I have 100,000 employees or 150,000 employees. But this is not about large or small because your budget, as you said, went from $825,000. It was bottomed out. It's really about the leadership and the culture. And I think this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, the corporate, if you will, promise or the corporate focus on training. Is that where this kind of developed over the last 3 years?
Yeah, absolutely. The money came back, the budgets came back, and that certainly helped. Across the board from the Weather Service, our budgets were coming back from the sequester days. But it really has been that corporate focus on, hey, training is really important. And it's so easy in federal agencies, and I'm sure it's true in the private sector too, when revenues are dropping, well, we're going to drop training and we're going to drop travel and all of those things. And anymore, we think twice before that happens. So we'll see what happens during the next downturn. But right now, we're about as good as we've ever been, and really happy about that.
That's obviously really good news, and I think other agencies can learn from what you guys are doing. You also mentioned earlier on about we're really taking a look at how we can make sure we're hiring and training effective managers and supervisors. Walk me through what that's looking like and how you are addressing this big challenge.
Sure. And again, going back to that everyday leadership theory, we build leadership into a lot of the classes that we offer, from new hires all the way to the point where you become a supervisor. So that builds that. Is it complete? No, we're still engineering and still creating this, but we have a kind of a stair-step approach to it. And that, as a new employee, as a new hire, you need to know yourself. You need to know who you are and what you're good at and what you're not good at, and maybe where you could improve upon. And then as you move on to your career, all of a sudden you're a team member. And so how can you be a contributing team member within your work group, if you're working on extra projects and things like that? Further along, you show some more expertise and you find yourself you're a team lead. You're not quite a supervisor yet, but you have more influence and you have the ability to lead a team. And so what are the skills and abilities that you need to do that? And then further along in your career, all of a sudden you've become the supervisor. And so we've got training for those new supervisors, and it's again totally different skill set from that. And then ultimately we want to get to that executive level. So we take our senior execs and we work with the Federal Executive Institute in Charlottesville. But what other opportunities are out there, even for our senior executives, to sharpen that saw to keep them on top of their game? So, it's a little bit broken. Certainly a little more resources would help, but we're doing the best we can. But that's the overall philosophy: is we grow people from early on in their career to the next thing you know, you might be in charge of something big.
And this training is not just for new hires. This training, when we talk about supervisors and managers, is for anybody at any point in their career. People come, as you mentioned, maybe over from NASA to be a manager or supervisor, or people who have come up through the ranks like yourself, starting as a GS5 intern. So you really are finding that balance of, okay, let's identify the people and then make sure that they can succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's ultimately what it's all about, is providing the resources out there for people to succeed. Which brings me just a little side note here: the difference between training and learning. Jason, I can train you to do a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can repeat the behavior, and that's on you. That's a personal accountability piece. So I could train you to do, I don't know, I could train you how to issue a warning. But in the heat of the battle, could you actually repeat that behavior? Maybe so, maybe not. If you can repeat that behavior, then you've learned something. That's the difference between training and learning. And that's also been a shift that we've been making here in the Weather Service, and it's been happening all across the corporate world as well. It's a two-way street. Training is nice. I can spend a lot of money and I can do a lot of training, but unless the person's behavior actually changes and they've learned something and they've changed the way they do things for the better, then is it really good or not? And so ultimately that's our goal, is to change those behaviors in how you do your job.
It's funny because it's a very similar discussion of the difference between data and information, right? Data creates information, or does information create data? So I like
Yeah.
that, training versus learning. John, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. One of the big areas is retention. I think we'll jump into that next. My guest is John Ogren, the Chief Learning Officer of the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA at the Department of Commerce. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to the discussion Providing a Modern Learning Experience, sponsored by Cornerstone On Demand on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.